All right, first course. Food is good. My first indication that food was something my first indication that food was something other than a substance once stuffed in one's face when hungry, like filling up at a gas station, came after fourth grade in elementary school, was on a family vacation to Europe on the Queen Mary. In the cabin class dining room, there's a picture somewhere of my mother in her Jackie O sunglasses, my younger brother and I in our painfully cute cruise wear, boarding the big Canard ocean liner, all of us excited about our first transatlantic voyage, our first trip to my father's ancestral homeland, France. It was a soup, it was cold. This was something of a discovery for a curious fourth grader whose entire experience of soup to this point had consisted of Campbell's cream with tomato and chicken noodle. I'd eaten in restaurants before, sure, but this was the first food I really noticed. It was the first food I enjoyed and, more important, remembered enjoying. I asked our patient British waiter what this delightfully cool, tasty liquid was. Let me see what this is. Vic Soir, came the reply, a word that to this day, even though it's now a tired old warehouse of a menu selection and one I've prepared thousands of times, still has a magical ring to it. I remember everything about the experience, the way our waiter ladled it from a silver tureen into my bowl, the crunch of tiny chopped chives he spooned on as garnish, the rich, creamy taste of leek and potato, the pleasurable shock, the surprise that it was cold. I don't remember much else about the passage across the Atlantic. I saw Boing Boing with Jerry Lewis and Tony Curtis, the Queen's movie theater, in a Bourdain flick. The old liner shuddered and groaned and vibrated terribly the whole way. Barnacles on the hull, Hull, was the official explanation, and from New York to Cherbourg, it was like riding atop a giant lawnmower. My brother and I quickly became bored and spent much of our time in the teen lounge listening to House of the Rising Sun on the jukebox or watching the water slosh around like a contained tidal wave in the below-deck saltwater pool. But that cold soup stayed with me. It resonated, waking me up, making me aware of my tongue, and in some way preparing me for my future events. My second pre-epiphany in my long climb to chefdom also came during that first trip to France. After docking, my mother, brother, and I stayed with my cousins in a small seaside town near La Cabourg, a bleak, chilly resort area in Normandy on the English Channel. The sky was almost always cloudy. The water was inhospitably cold. All the neighborhood kids thought I knew Steve McQueen and John Wayne personally as an American. It was assumed we were all pals, that we hung out together on the range, riding horses and gunning down miscreants, so I enjoyed a certain celebrity right away. The beaches, while no good for swimming, were studded with old Nazi blockhouses and gun emplacements, many still bearing visible bullet scars and the scorch of flamethrowers, and there were tunnels under the dunes, all very cool for a little kid to explore. My little French friends were, I was astonished to find, allowed to have a cigarette on Sunday, were given watered vin ordinaire at the dinner table, and best of all, they owned Valo Solex motorbikes. This was a way to raise kids, I recall thinking, unhappy that my mother did not agree. So for my first few weeks in France, I explored underground passageways looking for dead Nazis, played miniature golf, sneaked cigarettes, read a lot of Tintin and Asterix comics, scooted around on my friends' motorbikes, and absorbed little life lessons from observations that, for instance, the family friend Monsieur Dupont brought his mistress to some meals and his wife to others. His extended brood of children apparently indifferent to the switch. I was largely unimpressed by the food. The butters tasted strangely cheesy to my undeveloped palate. The milk, a mandatory ritual in the 60s American kiddie life, was undrinkable here. Lunch seemed always to consist of sandwich au jambon or croque monsieur. Centuries of French cuisine had yet to make an impression. What I noticed about food French style was what they didn't have. After a few weeks of this, we took a night train to Paris, where we met up with my father in a spanking new Rover sedan Mark III, our touring car. In Paris, we stayed at the Hotel Lutetia, then a large, slightly shabby old pile on Boulevard Haussmann. The menu selections for my brother and me expanded somewhat to include steak frites and steak hamburger. We did all the predictable touristy things, climbed the Tower Eiffel, picnic in the Bois de Boulogne, marched past the great works at the Louvre, pushed toy sailboats around the fountain in the Jardin de Luxembourg. None of it much for fun for a 9-year-old with an already developing criminal bent. My principal interest at this time was adding to my collection of English translations of Tintin adventures. Hergé's crisply drafted tales of drug smuggling, ancient temples, and strange and faraway places and cultures were real exotica for me. Heard G's crispy drafted tales of drug smuggling, ancient temples, and strange and faraway places and cultures were really exotic for me. I prevailed on my poor parents to buy $100 worth of these stories at W.H. Smith's, the English bookstore, just to keep me from whining about the deprivations of France. With my little short shorts a permanent affront, I was quickly becoming a sullen, moody, difficult little bastard. I fought constantly with my brother, carped about everything, and was in every possible way a drag on my mother's glorious expedition. Okay, hold on, guys. My parents did their best. They took us everywhere from restaurant to restaurant, cringing no doubt every time we insisted on steak hachi with ketchup, no less, and a coca. They endured silently my gripes about cheesy butter and seemingly endless amusement I took in advertisements for a popular soft drink of the time. Shit. I want shit. I want shit. They managed to ignore my eye rolling and fidgeting when they spoke French. They tried to encourage me to find something, anything to enjoy. And there came a time when finally they didn't take the kids along. I remember it well because it was such a slap in the face. It was a wake-up call that food could be important and a challenge to my natural belligerence by being denied a door open. The town's name was Vienne. We'd driven miles and miles of road together. My brother and I were fresh out of tin-tins and cranky as hell. The French countryside with its graceful tree-lined roads, hedge crows, tilled fields, and picture book villages provided little distraction. My folks had by now endured weeks of relentless complaining through many tense and increasingly unpleasant meals. They dutifully ordered our steak hatch, crudites, varies, sandwich au jambon, sandwich jambon, I think like ham, and be like and the like long enough. They put up with our grousing that the beds were too hard, the pillows too soft, the neck rolls and toilets and plumbing were too weird. They even allowed us a little watered wine, as it was clearly the French thing to do, but also I think to shut us up. They taken my brother and me, the two ugliest little Americans everywhere. Vienne was different. They pulled the gleaming new Rover into the parking lot of a restaurant called, rather promisingly, La Pyramide, handed us what was apparently a hoarded stash of Tintins, and then left us in the car. It was a hard blow. Little brother and I were left in that car for over 3 hours, an eternity for two miserable kids already bored out of their minds. I had plenty of time to wonder what could be so great inside those walls. They were eating in there, I knew that, and it was certainly a big deal. Even at a witless age 9, I could recognize the nervous anticipation, the excitement, the reverence in which my beleaguered parents had approached this hour, and I had the Vicky Swa incident still fresh in my mind. Food, it appeared, could be important. It could be an event. It had secrets. I know now, of course, that La Pyramide, even in 1966, was the center of the culinary universe. Bocuse, choice gros, everybody had done their time there, making their bones under the legendarily fearsome proprietor, Ferdinand Point. Point was a grandmaster of cuisine at the time, and La Pyramide was mecca for foodies. This was a pilgrimage for my earnestly Francophile parents. In some small way, I got that through my tiny, empty skull on the back of the sweltering parked car. Even then, things changed. I changed after that. First of all, I was furious, but always a great motivating force in my life caused me to become suddenly adventurous where food was concerned. I decided then that to outdo my foodie parents, at the same time I could gross out my still uninitiated little brother. I'd show them who the gourmet was. Brains, sneaky running cheese that smelled like dead men's feet, horse meat, sweetbreads, bring it on. Whatever had the most shock value became my meal of choice. For the rest of that summer and in the summers that followed, I ate everything. I scooped gooey basharin, looked to love the cheesy, rich Normandy butter, especially slathered on baguettes and dipped in butter, hot chocolate. I sneaked red wine whenever possible, tried frites, tiny whole fish fried and eaten with persilade. Loving that, I was eating heads, eyes, bones, and all. I ate Ray and Bourdain noisette, saucisson, y al tripes, rognas de veau, kidneys, boudin noir that squirted blood down my chin, and I had my first oyster. Now this was a truly significant event. I remember losing my virginity, and in many ways more fondly. August of that summer was spent in La Teste de Bouche, a tiny oyster village on the Basin de Arachon in the Guernsey, southwest France. We stayed with my aunt, Tante Jeanne, and my Uncle Gustave in the same red tile-roofed, white stucco house where my father had summered as a boy. Tante Jeanne was a frumpy, bespectacled, slightly smelly old man. Uncle Gustave, a geezer in coveralls and beret who smoked hand-rolled cigarettes until they disappeared onto the tip of his tongue. Little had changed about La Testa in the years since my father had vacationed there. The neighbors were still all oyster fishermen. Their families still raised rabbits and grew tomatoes in the backyards. Houses had 2 kitchens, an inside one and an outdoor fish kitchen. There was a hand pump for drinking water from the well, and an outhouse by the rear of the garden. Lizards and snails were everywhere. The main tourist attraction were the nearby dune of Pila, Europe's largest sand dune, and the nearby resort town of Arachon, where the French flocked in unison for Les Grandes Vacances. Television was a big event. At 7 o'clock, when the 2 national stations would come on in the air, Uncle Gustave would solemnly emerge from his room with the key chained to his hip and ceremoniously unlock the cabinet doors that covered the screen. My brother and I were happier here. There was more to do. The beaches were warm and closer in climate to what we knew back home, with the added attraction of the ubiquitous Nazi blockhouses. There were lizards to hunt down and exterminate with readily available petards, firecrackers that one could buy legally over the counter. There was a forest within walking distance where an actual hermit lived, and my brother and I spent hours there spying on him from the underbrush. By now I could read and enjoy comic books in French, and of course I was really eating. Murky brown soupe de poisson, tomato salad, moulets marinières, poulet basquoise. We were only a few miles from the Basque country. We made day trips to Cap Ferret, a wild, deserted, and breathtaking, magnificent Atlantic beach with big rolling waves, taking along baguettes and saucissons and wheels of cheese, wine, and Evian. Bottled water was at the time unheard of back home. A few miles west was La Casaux, a freshwater lake where my brother and I could rent pedalo, watercraft, and pedal our way around the deep. We ate gaufres, delicious hot waffles covered in whipped cream and powdered sugar. The 2 hot songs of that summer on the Casau jukebox were White Shade of Pale by Procol Harum and These Boots Were Made for Walking by Nancy Sinatra. The French played those 2 songs over and over again, the music punctuated by the sonic booms from French Air Force jets that would swoop over the lake on their way to a nearby bombing range. With all the rock and roll, good stuff to eat, and high explosives at hand, I was reasonably happy. So when our neighbor Monsieur St. George, the oyster fisherman, invited my family out on his oyster boat, I was enthusiastic. At 6 in the morning, we boarded Monsieur St. George's small wooden vessel with our picnic baskets and our sensible footwear. He was a crusty old bastard dressed like my uncle in ancient denim coveralls, espadrilles, and beret. He had a leathery, tanned, and windblown face, hollow cheeks, and the tiny broken blood vessels on nose and cheeks that everyone seemed to have from drinking so much of the local Bordeaux. He hadn't fully briefed his guests on what was involved in these daily travails. We putted out to a buoy marking his underwater oyster park, a fenced-off section of bay bottom, and we sat in the roaring August sun waiting for the tide to go out. The idea was to float the boat over the stockaded fence walls, then sit there until the boat slowly sank with the water level until it rested on the basin floor. At this point, Monsieur St. George and his guests presumably would rake the oysters, collect a few good specimens for sale in port, and remove any parasites that might be endangering this crop. There was, I recall, still about 2 feet of water left to go before the whole of the boat settled on dry ground and we could walk about the park. We'd already polished off the braai and baguettes and downed the Evian, but I was still hungry and characteristically said so. Monsieur St. George, on hearing this, as if challenging his American passengers, inquired in his thick Gironde accent if any of us would care to try an oyster. My parents hesitated. I doubt they'd realize they might actually have to eat one of the raw, slimy things we were currently floating over. My little brother recoiled in horror. But I, in the proudest moment of my young life, stood up smartly, grinning with defiance, and volunteered to be the first. And in that unforgettably sweet moment in my personal history, that one moment still more alive for me than so many of the other firsts that followed, first pussy, first joint, first day in high school, first published book, or any other thing, I attained glory. Monsieur St. George beckoned me over to the gunwale, where he leaned over, reached down until his head nearly disappeared underwater, and emerged holding a single silt-encrusted oyster, huge and irregularly shaped in his rough claw-like fist with a snubby, rust-covered oyster knife. He popped the thing open and handed it to me, everyone watching now, my little brother shrinking away from this glistening, vaguely sexual-looking object still dripping and nearly alive. I took it in my hand, tilted the shell back into my mouth as instructed by the now beaming Monsieur St. George, and with a bite and a slurp whiffed it down. It tasted of seawater, of brine and flesh, and somehow of the future. Everything was different now, everything. I not only survived, I enjoyed. This, I knew, was a magic of which I had until now only been dimly and spitefully aware. I was hooked. My parents shuddered. My little brother's expression of unrestrained revulsion and amazement only reinforced the sense that I had somehow become a man. I had had an adventure, tasted Tasted forbidden fruit and everything that followed in my life. The food, the long and often stupid and self-destructive chase for the next thing. Whether it was drugs or sex or some other new sensation would all stem from this moment. I learned something viscerally, instinctively, spiritually, even in some small, precursive way sexually, and there was no turning back. The genie was out of the bottle. My life as a cook and as a chef had begun. Food had power. It could inspire, astonish, shock, excite, delight, and impress. It had the power to please me and others. This was valuable information. For the rest of that summer and in late summers, I'd often slip off on myself to the little stands by the port where one could buy brown paper bags of unwashed, black-covered oysters by the dozen. After a few lessons from my new soulmate, blood brother, and bestest buddy, Monsieur Saint George, who was now sharing his after-work bowls of sugared vin ordinaire with me too, I could easily open the oysters by myself, coming in from behind with the knife and popping the hinge like it was Aladdin's eye. I'd sit in the garden among the tomatoes and the lizards and eat my oysters and drink Kronenbergs. France was a wonderland for underage drinkers. France was happily reading Modesty Blay and the Katzenjammer Kids and the lovely hardbound Bandes Dessinées in French until the pictures swam in front of my eyes, smoking the occasional pilfered jetain. I still associate the taste of oysters with those heady, wonderful days of illicit late afternoon buzzes, the smell of French cigarettes, the taste of beer, that unforgettable feeling of doing something I shouldn't be doing. I had, as yet, no plans to cook professionally, but I frequently looked back at my life, searching for that fork in the road, trying to figure out where exactly I went bad and became a thrill-seeking, pleasure-hungry and sensualist, always looking to shock, amuse, terrify, and manipulate, seeking to fill that empty spot in my soul with something new. I like to think it was Monsieur Saint George's fault, but of course, it was me all along, seeking to fill that empty spot in my soul. All right, that was the end of a first course. Food is good, first course.